Hello everybody, my name is Asher, and today I'm going to be ranking all 32 NFL teams for the 2024 season/2025 season from worst to best. Before I start the video, I will give a quick guide on how I will rank these teams. Factors like a positive record, winning a division, playoff appearances, and playoff wins will put teams higher on the list. Teams that do the opposite of this will be put lower on the list. I will also look on how tough a team's schedule was and how impressive their wins were. And if a team that ended the season on a strong note will be put higher on the list, but a team that collapsed at the end will be put lower on the list. Please note that my personal thoughts on how I feel about an NFL team will not affect this ranking. I'm strictly trying to be as objective and as fair as I can in my rankings. That being said, let's start off with number 32. Number 32, the Tennessee Titans. Surprisingly, choosing the last spot was hard this year since there are a lot of bad teams, but I ultimately decided to go with the Titans, and I gave them an F tier for their 3-14 season. So the Titans being the worst team this season was a little bit surprising since they did have a good amount of players on their team, like with DeAndre Hopkins, L'Jarius Sneed, Tony Pollard, and Jeffrey Simmons, and a lot of fans were hyped about this team. However, there were many holes in the Titans that became problems for them. First off, their quarterback selection this year was absolutely terrible. Will Levis was their primary option, and he ended the season with 12 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, and had 8 fumbles, and his worst game of the season was when he threw 3 interceptions against the Bengals' bad passing defense. Mason Rudolph also started in a decent amount of games, but had a similar result. The Titans also had a terrible offensive line, were 29th in sacks, and Brian Callahan's first year as a rookie head coach did not go so well. The few positive things that the Titans had going this year was that their defense was great at stopping teams from getting too much yardage per game, and they had a good win against the Texans at their stadium in Week 12. Other than that, the Titans won the Razzie Award this year, and hopefully the number 1 draft pick will help them out next year. Number 31, Cleveland Browns. This year, the Cleveland Browns had a god-awful season, and a big reason for that is that their ownership and general management of the team is incompetent at their jobs, and have been in rebuild mode since 1989. They should have never gotten rid of Baker Mayfield, and they definitely shouldn't have paid Deshaun Watson $230 million after his allegations and lawsuits incidents. Watson's also had a bad year of only 5 touchdowns for 3 interceptions, and the entire offense looked dead when he was their quarterback. When Deshaun Watson got injured in Week 7, the rest of the Cleveland quarterbacks didn't solve the problem. The best option that they had was Jameis Winston, and while Winston had a few good games here and there, his turnover problem caught up to him. In his final game, he had 3 interceptions with 0 touchdowns. The Browns' offensive yards per game was also ranked 29th in the league and had the worst turnover ratio in the league, with 12 takeaways and 34 giveaways. Despite the suffering Browns fans have had to go through this season, there were a few bright spots, with Pro Bowler players like Jerry Jeudy, Myles Garrett, and Denzel Ward having a great season. The Browns also successfully defended their stadiums against the Steelers and Ravens with 2 big upset wins. Number 30, New York Giants. The Giants this year had many problems in 2024, with a lot of their problems coming from very questionable decisions for the management of this team. They got rid of Saquon Barkley to the Eagles, and I understand why they did that. They wanted to save money for the salary cap, but then you turn around and re-sign Daniel Jones and give him $160 million, which backfired because Jones had a bad season and they eventually traded him off to the Vikings. And since the team had no solid quarterback replacement, the Giants started taking a lot of giant L's. Both their passing and rushing game was weak, and the Giants had 23 turnovers this season. They also lost all of their divisional games and didn't win a single home game until Week 17. Although the Giants were a bad team this year, they were effective at getting sacks with good players like Dexter Lawrence and Brian Burns, and Malik Nabers also had a great rookie season. They also had 2 really good upset wins against the Seahawks and Colts, and in the Colts game, Drew Lock threw for 309 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, and 1 rushing touchdown. And the Giants had allowed no turnovers and no sacks. The Giants' future is uncertain, but let's hope they'll be better next year. Number 29, the New England Patriots. The Patriots finished the season with a 4-13 record, and it was a very messy season and rough season for the Patriots. Robert Kraft made a really dumb decision when he had hired Gerard Mayo to be his next head coach after Belichick's departure. And this was a dumb decision because Mayo was promoted from linebackers coach to head coach, even though he had no actual experience being a coordinator. And it seemed like Kraft hired him due to his past when he was a Patriots player. Gerard was later fired after the season was over, and it seemed like a waste of time to even put him there in the first place. The Patriots also lacked a lot of overall talent, and almost all of their skill positions were bad, and only their running game was somewhat average. On the upside, rookie quarterback Drake May did good his first season, despite him having terrible offensive line and having bad offensive weapons, and Christian Gonzalez was a good cornerback. Even though they only won 4 games, they had a good Week 1 win against the Bengals, had a blowout win against the Bears, and won 2 divisional games against the Jets and Bills backups. While the Patriots had an overall bad season, winning 4 games is still a positive considering that they had very little talent at their skill positions. Number 28, the Las Vegas Raiders. After failing to find a quarterback in last year's draft, the Raiders' options for QBs were limited. Gardner Minshew and Desmond Ridder both had terrible stats, but Aiden O'Connell actually had a decent year and showed improvement from last year. But for some reason, Antonio Pierce didn't use him in more games. The Raiders' overall offense was soft and had a lot of sloppy turnovers, and the good defense from last year became very average. That being said, the good thing about this team was that rookie tight end and Pro Bowler Brock Bowers had an amazing season with 1,194 yards, and Jacoby Myers, Max Crosby, and Jack Jones had good performances too. The Raiders' best moment in this season was when they had a comeback victory over the Ravens in Week 2 and won at the Ravens Stadium despite being a 10-point underdog. And they also won 2 games in a row against the Jaguars and Saints. Hopefully next year the Raiders fans will be given a more competitive team since this team has been trying to figure it out since 2002. Number 27, the Jacksonville Jaguars. Out of all the 4-13 teams, the Jaguars, in my opinion, were the best, and the Jaguars this year were a dysfunctional mess. Their head coach, Doug Peterson, was bad at calling plays, and while Peterson is a legendary coach for giving the Eagles their first Super Bowl win, he has never had the same success again and is a one-hit wonder. Trevor Lawrence, before his injury, had a mediocre season too, and their offense was lackluster and had a turnover problem. The Jaguars' defense was also soft, with the exception of Trayvon Walker, and they allowed 389.9 yards per game. They did have some bright spots here and there with players like Brian Thompson Jr. and Tank Bigsby, and they had a good kicking team. They also swept the Titans and went 3-3 in the division and were competitive in all of their divisional games. And they have successfully defended their stadium 10 times in a row against the Colts since 2015. Maybe with a new coach, the Jaguars could do better in 2025. Number 26, the Chicago Bears. The Monsters of the Midway had a lot of hype due to drafting Caleb Williams, and Bears fans had hope once again. Sadly, the Bears decided to screw over their fans for the 500th time and ended the season with a 5-12 record. The Bears' ownership and management of the team is 100% responsible for this outcome, and they should have fired Matt Eberflus before the season even started, since he was already a bad coach, and throughout the season he had terrible time management and sloppy play calling that costed the Bears a lot of games. Caleb Williams had a great rookie season, but his offensive line completely failed at their jobs, and he was brutally sacked 68 times this season. Chicago did start strong with a 4-2 record, but after their Hail Mary loss to the Commanders, they went on a 10-game losing streak, but they did finish the season on a positive note after beating the Packers 24-22, and finally ended their losing streak against the Packers that's been going on since 2018. Number 25, the New Orleans Saints. The Saints were a weird team this season. They started off hot in the first 2 weeks when they dropped over 40 points on the Panthers and Cowboys, and they looked like they were on track to win the division. However, Dennis Allen's bad coaching finally caught up to the team, and they went on a 7-game losing streak, and Allen was fired after his loss to the Panthers. And another reason why the Saints were bad was due to massive injuries. A perfect example of this is when they faced the Packers at Lambeau and were shut out with almost all of their starting players being injured, like Derek Carr, Alvin Kamara, and Chris Olave, to name a few. Not much good happened after the first 2 weeks for the Saints, but later on in the season, they did win 2 games in a row against the Falcons and Browns, and regardless how painful this season was, Saints fans at least traded with their hated rival, the Falcons. Number 24, the New York Jets. After a disappointing season last year when Aaron Rodgers got hurt, many Jets fans were hyped to see him return and had hoped to make a postseason run. However, the Jets did not live up to the hype and finished the season with a 5-12 record. Woody Johnson, the Jets owner, is mainly the cause for most of their problems due to his firing of Robert Saleh after a 2-3 start in the midseason. Now, Robert Saleh was a bad head coach before this season started. His team was always sloppy and committed a lot of penalties like false starts and delay of games 24/7, but Woody should have fired him before the season started and not in the middle of it, because it made the Jets' penalty problems 100 times worse and destroyed the Jets' momentum of even having a chance at winning games this season. The second biggest problem with the Jets was their offense. Their passing game was very average, and rushing stats were bad, and the Jets did choke a lot of games due to their kicker, Greg Zuerlein, missing a lot of kicks, like in the Broncos game in Week 4. Now, I will admit, for someone who is in his early 40s, Aaron Rodgers played good for his age, but obviously Rodgers was way out of his prime and had pretty slow movement, and is not the long-term solution to the Jets either. The Jets still had a good overall defense, and their top wins of the season was when they beat the Texans on Halloween and gave the Dolphins a loss on their final game of the season. Sadly, the Jets, outside of one Super Bowl win and a few AFC Championship appearances here and there, are a badly run franchise, and Jets fans will have to wait another year to see if they can break their long 14-year playoff drought. Number 23, Carolina Panthers. The Panthers finished 5-12, and while they had a bad season, there were still a lot of improvements from what we saw from them in 2023, when they went 2-15. In the beginning of the season, the Panthers did look terrible, and Bryce Young's stats were sluggish, and he was benched for Andy Dalton in Week 3. Although they did win in Week 3 with Dalton against the Raiders, the veteran quarterback started to regress, and after the Red Rocket was involved in a car accident, David Canales made Bryce the starter again. In the following games, Young still had some interceptions, but his yards per game looked a lot better, and he started throwing more touchdowns. In the Panthers' final game of the season, Bryce Young had a monster game and threw for 251 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 rushing touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. But the Panthers' biggest flaw was their horrible defense. The defense allowed 404.5 yards per game, and their linebackers could not tackle or get pressure on opposing teams' quarterbacks. And the only time the defense looked good was in the Chiefs game, when they sacked Mahomes 5 times. Since David Tepper has taken over as an owner, the Panthers have not had a winning season or make the playoffs. But hey, maybe next year could be their year. Number 22, San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers went 6-11 this season, and in my opinion, there were 3 main reasons why they had a dud season. So first off, the 49ers before this year have been a great team since 2019, and have made a lot of deep playoff runs with 2 Super Bowl appearances and 4 NFC Championship appearances. However, the 49ers are not a dynasty, and when you make multiple deep playoff runs like that without Super Bowl wins, eventually you're going to have a slump year and start to fall off. The 49ers also dealt with a lot of constant injuries throughout the season, which didn't help, and their best example was that their most important player, Christian McCaffrey. He didn't start the season due to multiple Achilles sprains in both feet, and when he returned to the NFL, in the Bills game, he sprained his PCL in the right knee. And when the team wasn't injured, a lot of their big-name players had disappointing season, like with Deebo Samuel Sr. and Brandon Ayuk, with multiple drop passes throughout the season. You also had a lot of missed kicks from Jake Moody, and I would say his worst performance was in the Buccaneers game, with 3 for 6 field goals made. They also did very poorly in their divisional games, and went 1-5 with their only win against the Seahawks at Lumen Stadium. The few good things the 49ers did was that their offense was still overall good, and they had 2 good back-to-back wins against the Cowboys and Buccaneers. And for next year, we'll have to see if they'll be able to make another deep playoff run, or if their era is officially over. Number 21, the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys went 7-10 this year, and were a very average team in the NFL. They had mixed results with both their defense and offense. They were effective at passing the ball, but their running game for the most part was weak. And the Dallas defense was great at getting sacks, but their defensive yards per game were 28th in the league. The Cowboys went 3-3 in their division. They swept the Giants, traded with the Commanders, and got blown up by the Eagles both times. They had a lot of embarrassing losses, like against the Saints, Lions, and Texans, but they also had a lot of good wins, like with the Buccaneers, Panthers, and Steelers. Overall, there isn't really much to say about the Cowboys season this year. The season was disappointing for their fans, and the last time they went negative was in 2020, but it wasn't completely terrible either. Overall, just a very average and plain season for the Cowboys, and we'll see what they have to offer next year. Number 20, the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts went 8-9 this season, and had a lot of ups and downs throughout 2024. Their main problem this season was bad quarterback play, with their 2 main options being Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco. Richardson was a terrible passing quarterback this year, and he had a 47.7 completion rating and had 12 interceptions with 8 passing touchdowns. However, he did have 499 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. Joe Flacco wasn't much better and had a lot of inconsistent games, and Flacco is clearly meant to just strictly be a backup at this point. The Colts' defense was also very soft, and they were overall not very good at getting sacks, and their defensive yards per game were 29th in the league. The defense's worst performance was in the Giants game, in which the Colts were fighting for a playoff spot, but the defense couldn't get a single sack or turnover, and let a bad Giants team do whatever they wanted and lost the game. However, the Colts did have a great running game, with Jonathan Taylor having a monster year and was without a doubt the team's best player. Number 19, Miami Dolphins. The Fins were just an average team in 2024. They went 3-3 in the division, and while they were able to sweep the Patriots, they weren't able to beat the Bills, and they traded with the Jets. The team also seemed very one-sided too, and when Tua Tagovailoa got injured, Dolphins looked putrid and completely fell apart when he was recovering. And I know winning games without your starting quarterback is tough, but when the offense looks this lifeless, that means your team was not good at adapting, which is important in the NFL. When Tua returned, the team had mixed success. They lost a lot of close games, like with the Cardinals and second encounter with the Bills. They destroyed some bad teams, but they also got destroyed by good teams here and there. Their overall offense was average, but their defense was pretty good, and were fourth in defensive yards allowed per game. This was a disappointing season for the Dolphins fans, and since the year 2000, they have not been a very competitive team and have been very average. Number 18, Arizona Cardinals. The Arizona Cardinals started the season off with a 6-4 record before their Week 11 bye week, and a lot of fans thought that they could win the division and make it to the playoffs. However, the Cardinals completely collapsed after their bye week and finished 8-9. The Cardinals were a pretty whatever team. They had a solid offense with a good running scheme, but it wasn't strong enough to carry their mediocre defense. They had a lot of good games, like when they beat the Rams 41-10 and pulled off a lot of close wins with the Dolphins and Chargers, but they had way too many bad blowout losses to teams that finished with a winning record, and had completely choked against a game with the Panthers that ended their season. The Cardinals had a chance to win their division this year, and if they had played a little bit better and more consistent, they could have, but at the end of the day, it wasn't good enough, and other teams in the division were better. Number 17, Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons had a very weird and inconsistent season in 2024. They started off pretty hot with a 6-3 record in Week 9, and they were able to sweep the Buccaneers and get a good upset win against the Eagles. However, Kirk Cousins fell off massively, and from Week 10 to Week 15, Kirk's stats from these games were 1 touchdown to 9 interceptions and 7 fumbles. This caused the Falcons to go on a 4-game losing streak, and suddenly the Falcons were not in control of the NFC South anymore. And when they got rid of Kirk Cousins for rookie QB Michael Penix, they were not able to finish out their remaining games with losses to the Commanders and Panthers, which ended their season, and the Buccaneers took over the division. Despite Kirk Cousins' downfall, the Falcons did have a pretty good overall offense, with players like Drake London, Darnell Mooney, and Bijan Robinson having a great season, but their defense wasn't good and were the second worst defense at getting sacks with only 31 for the entire year. Overall, the Falcons were a pretty mixed team. They had a good offense, but a bad defense, and if their quarterback play wasn't inconsistent, they could have won the division. But at the end of the day, this is the result we got from them, and we'll have to see if the Falcons can get over the slump of being an average team. Number 16, the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals were probably one of the most disappointing teams, and despite having the best passing offense in the league with 272.9 yards per game, and having Trey Hendrickson leading the league with 17.5 sacks, the Bengals still missed the playoffs. There were multiple reasons why the Bengals missed the postseason, and one of them was that their slow start to the season. Since Zach Taylor has been head coach, the Bengals have only had one season where they have had a positive record in the first 3 weeks, and this slow start has been a problem for Cincy for a while now. And when they started the season 0-3, it was pretty much over for them, since only a handful of teams have ever made it to the postseason while starting off 0-3. The Bengals' passing and safety defense was also incredibly bad, with their top cornerback Cam Taylor-Britt getting burnt out constantly throughout the season by most receivers. Their running game, kicking team, and offensive line was also terrible, and the Bengals were not able to finish close games and lost 7 games that were only by 1 score. The only positives about the Bengals season was that Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and Trey Hendrickson had great seasons. They were able to sweep the Cleveland Browns, a divisional opponent that they have struggled with in the past, and that they had a clutch win against the Denver Broncos in Week 17. The Bengals' future is very mixed right now. While they have had a lot of success recently in the postseason, in their last few years they have just missed the postseason, and it is unclear if they will maintain their success. Number 15, Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks were a solid team throughout the NFL season and finished 10-7. They had a good defense, but the problem for them this year was that their offense was very average and unreliable. The offensive line and running game for Seattle was terrible, and while their offense was decent, they had too many turnovers, with 24 giveaways and 18 takeaways. Geno Smith was also very inconsistent this season, and while he had good completion percentage and passing yards, he had a massive turnover problem and often finished games with a neutral touchdown to interception ratio. It also didn't help that the Seahawks struggled to beat good teams, with multiple blowout losses to the Packers, Vikings, Lions, and Bills. They also had an embarrassing loss to the New York Giants despite having a home field advantage, and if they had won that game, they could have had a better chance at winning the NFC West. Overall, the Seahawks were a solid team, but they were not able to win the big games and just barely missed the postseason. Number 14, the Denver Broncos. The Broncos this year were not a very hyped up team, and many people, myself included, thought that they would be bad. But to the surprise of many, the Broncos finished the season with a 10-7 record and finally broke their long 9-year playoff drought. A big reason why the Broncos had a good season was that the Denver's defense was great at covering wide receivers and were the best team at getting sacks, with players like Nick Bonito, Jonathan Cooper, and Patrick Surtain leading the Denver defense. Bo Nix also had a great rookie season with 29 touchdowns and 12 interceptions and 4 rushing touchdowns. However, despite what Denver accomplished this season, they were no match for the Buffalo Bills in the wild card and lost 31-7. Despite the loss, Denver's future is bright, and it seems like they have their team figured out, and all they need to do now is keep up with the momentum, and maybe at some point in the future, they can win a playoff game. Number 13, the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers had a pretty interesting season this year. They started off the season the right way, going 4-2 with Justin Fields as their starter. And while they did have a lot of embarrassing losses to the Colts and Cowboys, they still looked solid. In Week 7, Russell Wilson recovered from his injury, and the Steelers went on a 4-game winning streak and were on track to win the division and maybe even win a playoff game. But then Week 12 came around. They had an embarrassing loss to the Browns, and while they got 2 wins afterwards with the Bengals and Browns' second encounter, the Steelers fell apart and lost their last 4 games, and the team that everyone saw earlier in the season completely fell apart and looked horrible and worn out. The Black and Yellow still made it to the playoffs, but they were no match for the Ravens, and they were sent packing with another disappointing season. The main problem with the Steelers is that they have been a solid but not competitive team since their 2017 divisional loss to the Jaguars. The thing is, the Steelers have had all winning seasons and have made it to the playoffs 4 times after that playoff loss, but they have had no success, and I think a big reason why we keep seeing this is because the Steelers' ownership of the team and coaching staff is more focused on winning seasons rather than actually trying to compete and win for a Super Bowl. They're too good to get a high-round draft pick and easier game schedules, but they are too bad to actually make a good playoff run. This is a bad look for the Steelers because the entire point of an NFL team is to either win a Super Bowl or try to rebuild a team that will eventually win one. And the Steelers are not doing really either one of those things. And I have a feeling their problems won't be solved anytime soon. Number 12, Los Angeles Chargers. After moving on from Brandon Stanley, the Chargers hired Jim Harbaugh to be their new head coach, and Harbaugh was able to get the team to an 11-6 record and make it to the playoffs even though they had a very below average receiving and rushing core, outside of Ladd McConkey, of course. The Chargers' overall defense was amazing, and the Chargers were good at playing clean football and only gave the ball away 9 times throughout the season, and Justin Herbert had 23 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. But when they made it to the postseason to face the Texans, everything collapsed despite them being the favorite to win the game. The Texans' defense massacred Justin Herbert, and he had a pretty awful performance with 4 interceptions and 1 touchdown, and it seemed like the only person on the team trying was Ladd McConkey, and the Chargers lost 12-32. Don't get me wrong, this was still a good season for the Chargers, but that playoff loss left a sour taste in my mouth, since the entire team crumbled so easily. And poor performances for the Chargers in the playoffs has been a problem for them for a very long time. But maybe next season they'll be able to overcome this obstacle. Number 11, Green Bay Packers. The Packers went 11-6 this year, and Green Bay was a good and complete team and had no real major weakness stat-wise. They were effective at both offense and defense, and were able to beat teams that were either solid or bad, and got an impressive shutout win against the New Orleans Saints in Week 16. However, there was one major weakness that screwed over the Packers' season. They were awful in their division, and they were swept by both the Lions and Vikings, and even lost to the Bears. The Vikings and Lions were both the better teams, and Green Bay not being able to beat them caused the Packers to have a 7th seed in the playoffs, which meant that they had to play on the road, making winning harder for them. When they faced the Eagles in the playoffs, they were embarrassed, and the Eagles, despite not playing their best football, were able to secure a safe and controlled win, and the Packers team that we saw earlier in the season didn't show up. Jordan Love threw for 3 interceptions with no touchdowns, and the Packers defense failed to get a single interception. Overall, this is a very disappointing year for the Packers, and while they look good in the regular season, they weren't able to have that same success in the playoffs. Number 10, Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings started out 2024 pretty great, and they went on a 5-game winning streak. And Sam Darnold, despite him being bad in the past with other teams, was able to have good stats and looked like he had improved. After their bye week, they did have 2 losses in a row to the Lions and Rams, but they went back on track and won 9 games in a row. The Vikings were a pretty complete team this year, and it looked like they had a chance to win their division against the Lions, and maybe even win a Super Bowl. In the final week of the regular season, the Vikings had to beat the Lions in order to win the division, but if they failed, they would have to play on the road. It was a high-stakes game, winner takes all. But the Vikings that we saw earlier this year did not show up, and they got embarrassed by the Lions and choked winning the division and only were able to score 9 points. When playoff time came, they had to face the Rams again, and they played badly and lost the game, with Sam Darnold getting sacked 9 times, and the team was only able to score 9 points again. It obviously was a very disappointing season for Vikings fans, and for some strange reason, this franchise is really great in the regular season, but they always seem to collapse once the playoffs come and let their fans down. Maybe someday that'll change, but sadly this year it didn't. Number 9, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers had a pretty exciting but heartbreaking year, and they had a lot of ups and downs in between. They had a lot of impressive wins against good teams like the Eagles, Lions, Chargers, and swept the Panthers and Saints. However, the Bucs had a lot of bad losses. They were swept by the Falcons, a very average team. They got destroyed by the Broncos and Ravens, and lost to the 49ers and Cowboys. But it didn't really matter. The Falcons collapsed, and the Bucs secured their division and are ready to take on the Commanders. It seemed that they beat in the regular season. But sadly for the Bucs, despite the game being close, the Buccaneers lost in heartbreaking fashion, and the Commanders took advantage of their turnover, and eventually finished the game with a kick that sealed the deal. Despite the tough loss, the Buccaneers still had a good season, or definitely the best loser wildcard team, since their game was actually competitive. Number 8, Detroit Lions. I'm a little shocked that I had to put the Lions this low on the list, since I thought they had a good chance to win the Super Bowl, but we'll talk about the good and the bad with this team. So the Lions had an amazing regular season. They went 15-2, were undefeated in their division, and their only losses were to the Bills and Buccaneers, 2 playoff teams. They were also undefeated on the road, had 6 games where they scored 40 or more points, and were able to secure the number 1 seed. They had the second best offense with players like Jared Goff, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And they were a very entertaining team to watch. This offense often took risk and did a lot of creative trick plays. When the postseason came, the Lions had to take on the newly formed Commanders team with rookie QB Jaden Daniels and head coach Dan Quinn. The Lions had home field advantage and were favored to win by 9. What could go wrong? Well, apparently everything went wrong for the Lions. The injured defense failed to do their jobs. They had 0 sacks and no turnovers against the Commanders, and Jaden Daniels did whatever he wanted in that game. However, despite their defense being injured, I'm still going to blame the offense a lot too, because the offense that we saw in the regular season didn't show up. They had 5 turnovers. Jared Goff played terrible and had 3 interceptions and 1 fumble. And Jameson Williams threw an interception after a failed trick play. If the Lions didn't have these sloppy turnovers, they still would have won the game since they had a slightly better overall yards despite their turnovers. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. When you have this many mistakes in a playoff game, your chances of winning are slim, regardless of how good or bad you are. Number 7, Houston Texans. The Texans had a great but slightly disappointing season. Before the season started, the Texans had a lot of talent on both offense and defense, and after their impressive rebuild year last season with rookie CJ Stroud when they finished 10-7 and won a playoff game, Texans fans had a lot to look forward to. And Houston looked like they had a chance to even win the Super Bowl this year. But throughout the season, while the Texans were still a good team, they were not a Super Bowl contender and had a lot of struggles this year. Their offensive line was absolutely terrible. CJ Stroud did have a slump year, and Bobby Sullick didn't know what he was doing. The Texans had a lot of embarrassing losses. They lost to bad teams like the Jets and Titans, got destroyed by the Ravens and Vikings, and despite intercepting Goff 5 times in the Lions game, Houston still lost. But despite their struggles, they did have an amazing defense that was effective at getting sacks and covering wide receivers, and they were still able to win their division and make it to the postseason, where they were still the underdogs despite having home field advantage against the Chargers. But the Texans quickly forgot about their struggles in the regular season, and the defense was able to intercept Justin Herbert 4 times and even blocked an extra point and returned it for 2 points. Even though the offense had a slow start to the game, they were able to get going, and Stroud, Mixon, and Collins had a lot of great stats, and the team moved on into the divisional round, where they had to face the Chiefs. But the offensive problems from Houston showed in this game. Stroud was sacked 8 times, and the offense was only able to score a touchdown. So to summarize, the Texans had plenty of problems this year, but were able to still win 10 games, win their division, and win a playoff game. So they didn't decline from the year before, but they also didn't improve either, and we'll have to see what they have in store for us next year. Number 6, Los Angeles Rams. The Rams had a slow start to this season, starting 1-4, and a lot of their players like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua got injured early on in the season. But after their bye week, Sean McVay and his team were able to heal up, and the Rams took care of business and were able to get a lot of wins. They won most of their divisional games and even beat good teams like the Bills and Vikings. When Week 17 came, the Rams, despite their slow start, were able to win their division and had to face the Vikings in Arizona for the postseason. They got a very safe blowout win against the Vikings, and both the offense and defense were able to get a great team win. But in the divisional round, the Rams had to face the Eagles, and while it was a close game, the Rams were not able to stop Saquon Barkley and lost it. While the Rams were not good enough this year to go ahead of the divisional round, they still won a playoff game, and the team by the end of the season looked complete on both offense and defense, and I think this team has a good future. Number 5, Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens had a slow start to the season, starting 0-2, and had a really embarrassing loss to the Raiders after blowing a lead in the fourth quarter. But after this slow start, the Ravens got back on track and won 5 games in a row. They had the best overall offense in the league, and while the defense had a slow start, they became good at it by the end of the season. They continued to win more and more games, and despite some losses to the Browns, Steelers, and Eagles, they were able to come back and take the division from the Steelers and make it to the wild card. They faced the Steelers again and were able to get a safe win and moved on to Buffalo in the divisional round. And while they did have to play on the road, the team had 9 Pro Bowlers and were slightly better than the Bills. And the Ravens had Super Bowl hopes. But in the start of the game, Lamar Jackson was bad. He threw an interception and fumbled the ball, and throughout the game, the entire team was sloppy. The receivers had a lot of drop passes. Derrick Henry was not able to have a monster game like he usually does. The team had 3 turnovers, and they lost 43 yards in penalties. Meanwhile, the Bills were able to play clean football with no turnovers, and only lost 10 yards in penalties. Even though the Ravens were able to come back at the end, Mark Andrews choked and dropped the 2-point conversion to tie the game. But if we're being honest, the Ravens shouldn't have even been in this situation to begin with. If their 9 Pro Bowlers had played like they did in the regular season and not play sloppy, they should have won this game and tried to move on to the Super Bowl. So the Ravens still had a great season. They were dominant in the regular season and won a playoff game, but similar to the Lions, they underachieved in my opinion. Because of this roster, they should have at the very least been in the AFC Championship game. Number 4, Washington Commanders. Last year, the Commanders were 4-13 and were the second worst team in the league. But this year, the team made a lot of changes. Josh Harris took over as the new owner of the team after Dan Snyder's tenure was over. Dan Quinn was the new head coach, and Jaden Daniels was drafted for the quarterback position. Although they got destroyed their first game of the season to the Bucs, they quickly learned from this loss and proceeded to go on a 4-game winning streak and finished the season with a 12-5 record. Throughout the year, Jaden Daniels had an amazing rookie season, and the rest of the offense looked great. The bad defense from last year also improved and became solid. And while the Commanders weren't able to win their division, they secured the 6th seed and had to face the Buccaneers on the road. The game was close, but despite the team being fresh, they were able to get the win when Zane Gonzalez kicked a field goal, and the Commanders ended their 19-year playoff win drought. In the divisional round, the Commanders had to face the Lions and were 9-point underdogs. Many people thought that they would lose, but they shocked the world, and the Commanders' defense was able to get 5 turnovers, and Jaden Daniels had a flawless game and had one of the best rookie performances ever in the playoffs. They were headed to Philly for the conference championship, and they ended their 33-year conference appearance drought. But despite them having a great season, they were no match for the Eagles, and both the Philly offense and defense pulverized them, and they lost 23-55. Yeah, even though it sucked for Washington to go out like that, they still had a great season, and they were able to find their franchise QB and have a fresh start and finally be a competitive team that they once were. Number 3, Buffalo Bills. The Bills had a great but disappointing season. The Bills started off hot with 3 wins and continued the season with a 13-4 record. They were dominant in their divisional games with a 5-1 record, were undefeated at home, and beat the Chiefs and Lions in the regular season. The Bills' offense, while not being the top 5, was still good, and Josh Allen had a clean season with only 6 interceptions, the lowest in his career. James Cook was also a great running back, and the Bills were the best team at protecting the ball, with 32 takeaways and 8 giveaways. Buffalo was able to win their division easily and awaited the Broncos in the wildcard round. They took care of the Broncos easily, and in the divisional round, they defended their home by taking advantage of the Ravens' turnovers and played clean football against them. And they were headed to the championship game against the Chiefs. But sadly for the Bills, they blew another game against them and are 0-4 against the Chiefs in the postseason. Despite the Bills having a great season, in my opinion, they have been consistently underachieving throughout the Josh Allen era. Regardless if the Chiefs are a dynasty, being 0-4 against them in the playoffs is absolutely unacceptable. And what's even more frustrating is the Bills have been in the playoffs every year since 2019, but the only thing they have to show is 2 conference championship appearances. I think Sean McDermott and the Bills coaching staff is to blame for most of these losses, since they seem to get outcoached by higher playoff teams throughout the years. Maybe the Bills will be able to get over the hump at some point in the future, but for this season they weren't able to. Number 2, Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs had a great year and were without a doubt the best team in the AFC. In the regular season they faced a lot of problems. Patrick Mahomes had a really slow start to the season, their O-line was very inconsistent, and they did struggle with their offense throughout the season. But despite the Chiefs not looking like a powerhouse team, they were still able to get a 15-2 record and were a very clutch team, winning 11 games by 1 score or fewer. Their defense and coaching staff were also able to control games, which helped out their flawed offense, and they were able to get to the 1 seed and awaited the Texans in the divisional round. They took care of business against the Texans in a controlled game and faced the Bills in the AFC Championship. Even though the game was close, Kansas City was able to continue their dominance against the Bills and made their 7th Super Bowl appearance and had to face the Eagles. Before I talk negatively about their Super Bowl performance, I will give credit where credit is due. The Chiefs accomplished a lot recently. They are the only dynasty currently active in the league. They have been consistently appearing in the AFC Championship since 2018, have been to 5 Super Bowls and won 3 of them. That being said, their performance in this year's Super Bowl was terrible, plain and simple. Their entire offense was shut out for most of the game, and their first score didn't happen until the very end of the 3rd quarter. Mahomes had horrible stats. He threw 2 interceptions and had a fumble. The offensive line was useless against the Eagles' defense and allowed 6 sacks. And the Eagles also had significantly more time with the ball compared to the Chiefs. To simply put it, the Chiefs' offensive problems throughout the regular season showed up in this game, and the complete Eagles team took advantage of that and dominated this game from start to finish. Obviously, since the Chiefs are a dynasty and still control the AFC, they'll most likely be fine for the future, but that loss still hurts since they had a chance to make history and three-peat. Number 1, the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles were without a doubt the best team in the league this year and deserved to be Super Bowl winners since they were able to overcome their problems throughout the season. In the beginning, the Eagles were a very average and inconsistent team. They started 2-2 before the bye week, and while they beat the Packers and Saints, they lost horribly to the Buccaneers and choked a game to the Falcons due to bad coaching and clock mismanagement. But despite their sloppy start, after their bye week, the Eagles greatly improved and won 12 games, with their only loss being to the Commanders due to Hurts being injured and the defense having a bit of an off day. When the Eagles made it to the wild card round, They had a safe win against the Packers and moved on to the divisional round against the Rams. The game was close and the Rams put up a good fight, but the Eagles were able to squeeze out the win and made it to the NFC Championship game to face their hated rival, the Commanders. Like I said before, the Eagles destroyed the Commanders 55-23, and both the offense and defense did their jobs. They moved on to the Super Bowl and had to face the Chiefs, a team that they lost to the Super Bowl before. But the Eagles' performance we saw against the Commanders showed up. The defense had 3 turnovers, 6 sacks, and 6 forced punts, and the offense took care of business. They controlled the ball with 38 minutes of possession time and only had 1 turnover. Jalen Hurts also had a great performance with 221 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 72 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown. While the 2017 will always be the Eagles' best year since that's the first time they won their Super Bowl and it was against the Patriots dynasty, this year is a strong close second and the Eagles should be proud of themselves. They were able to overcome their recent Super Bowl loss against the Chiefs in 2022 and also fix their problems after the 2023 collapse. They got revenge against the Chiefs dynasty and saved America by preventing the three-peat. So that's my ranking for all 32 NFL teams this year. Let me know in the comments what your rankings is. And yeah, it was a pretty great year for the NFL. Josh Allen won MVP. The Commanders became a competitive team again, and the Eagles got their second ring. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.